and can do that without having to go through any sort of sexual reproduction at all, although they are capable of flowering. Many species are capable of flowering, but generally speaking, they duplicate by budding, and they double in mass under normal, everyday conditions every 48 hours, which makes them the fastest growing plant on Earth. And if you do the numbers, this means that a 10 centimeter squared patch of duckweed floating on water will grow to 1 hectare in only a couple of months. And that sort of gives you an idea of the scale of these remarkable plants. They can flower, though. This is a quite high magnification micrograph showing the flowers of duckweed. They're extremely simple. There's a simple style and 2 anthers, and you can even see some pollen here. So you can persuade them to flower, which helps with doing genetics. Probably the most important characteristic of aquatic plants that makes them highly relevant to carbon capture and also to the Azolla event, which I'll be coming back to later on, is that, of course, aquatic plants live on water. Most plants have to conserve their water, and as a result, the stomata, which allow exchange of gases between the atmosphere and the plant, are very important gatekeepers of water loss. They're also the gatekeeper of CO2 uptake. So if CO2 levels get very high, and this has actually been monitored in real terms with the raising of CO2 levels that's happening now, the stomata will actually close because they have enough CO2 already from their photosynthesis, and they're trying to protect themselves from losing water. So especially in hot and arid conditions, terrestrial plants will close their stomata. Duckweed, however, along with other aquatic plants, doesn't have to close its stomata because it doesn't have a water loss problem. It's already sitting on the water. And in fact, some species of duckweeds, the ones that we're using, like Lemna minor, can't close its stomata at all. So it's permanently available to take up CO2. And in fact, some very old physiological data taken, I think, in Brookhaven, actually, probably 20, 30 years ago, demonstrates this very nicely. So if in those days, if you grew duckweed at ambient CO2, 350 ppm, I could tell you it's a lot higher now, but back in 1985, that's what it was. You get this photosynthetic efficiency at these different light intensities, so it saturates out at this light intensity. But if you increase the CO2 to 5,000 ppm, you get even more CO2 fixation, and this is not true of most plants. You wouldn't see that dramatic gain. So duckweed is able to grow to respond to very high levels of CO2. And this is an experiment we do with Frank and also with John Shanklin at Brookhaven. Very simple experiment. This flask a week ago had a single duckweed frond inoculated into the medium, so did this one. But this one was grown in an incubator which had 400 ppm CO2, and this one was grown in one at 1,500 ppm. And you can see that we had a massive increase in doubling rate, up to 4 times the normal doubling rate, which means now it's doubling every 12 hours. That is remarkable, and it means that we can feed, or we like to say irrigate,
Is James Griffin? Is James Griffin here?
Oh, he was looking for his name tag.
Well, I'm looking for him. His name tag is looking. Ah, well, I don't know what he looks like, so I'm not going to follow him out there. But when he comes in, flag it.
All right, good evening. I think we should get started. Good evening. So, welcome to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. My name's David Stewart. I'm responsible for the meetings and courses program here at Cold Spring Harbor. The laboratory, for those of you who haven't been here before, was founded in 1890, and it's been a powerhouse for research in genetics and molecular biology for more than 125 years. Our research now spans fundamental cancer research, plant genetics, genomics and informatics, and a significant amount of our scientists now work broadly in neuroscience. In parallel with the scientific research that goes on here at Cold Spring Harbor, we host many scientific conferences and courses on areas spanning the life sciences, ranging from topics such as genome editing or CRISPR, Alzheimer's disease, to disorders of early childhood development. Some of the most significant discoveries in biology have first been discussed here. And in fact, back in 1986, in this, the newly built auditorium, Grace Auditorium, which we're now sitting, the auditorium witnessed the first discussion of the Human Genome Project, which of course has had a major impact in scientific research over subsequent years, and increasingly in the practice of medicine. Neuroscientist and Nobel laureate Eric Kandel has called Cold Spring Harbor a magical academic home away from home. And this is very much how I hope you will all feel after 3 intensive days of talks and discussions. In putting this Congress together, I want to emphasize that the driving force for putting the program together has been thanks to the inspiring vision of Children and Screens and the Institute of Digital Media and Child Development. Initial plans for this Congress grew out of discussions between Children and Screens and Cold Spring Harbor earlier this year, and following the very successful first Congress organized by the Foundation at the National Academy of Sciences, which no doubt many of you attended. And so I'm very happy to see all this work coming to fruition in the form of this second Children and Screens Congress on digital media and developing minds. So to kick the proceedings off, I'd like to invite one of the organizers on the Congress Committee, Dr. Dimitri Christakis from the Seattle Children's Research Institute, to introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really a privilege to be here. I have the honor of saying a few words to introduce our first speaker, whom I think you all know. So I only have, I think, an hour and 20 minutes to do this introduction. So I'm going to say more than a few words. I'm going to say three. The first word that comes to mind when I think of Pam is visionary. And like many of you, I've been a media researcher for some time. When I first met her, so about 6 years ago, Pam called me out of the blue. I had no idea who she was. And she self-identified as a pediatrician and as a parent, and she had some concerns about children in media that grew out of her own parenting experiences. And I hope I'm not speaking out of school. Pam has shared these with us. I think they were a real motivator for what she came to do. And one of the first things Pam said to me was that in being the quick study that she was and looking at what was happening, trying to figure out what the state of science around children media was, she said, you know, there's a lot of different disciplines studying this, and you all really don't talk with each other very well. You're all kind of in the same sandbox, but like toddlers, you're engaging in parallel play. So you kind of know who else is in the sandbox, and most of the times you've never met them. Sometimes you cite them, but you certainly don't play together. You certainly don't collaborate very much. And I think this was truly, I don't think it comes as a shock to anyone in this room, but the amazing thing about Pam was that she took it upon herself to take on this challenge. So I think of getting 20 different disciplines to work together, and I want to take a nap. And Pam looked at that and started the Institute for Children and Screens, which is what has brought us all together. And hewing that from nothing is a pretty daunting task, which brings me to the second word that I think of when I think of Pam, and that word is relentless. I think it really has made this vision of hers happen. Her relentlessness is, I think, in many ways made possible by the language she speaks. And some of you may know Pam's language. So for Pam, no means maybe means yes, and yes means how soon. And I think this has really been what has made this happen. It's what made the first Congress happen 3 years ago. It's what made this one happen. It's what's going to make the next one happen because she's already talking about it. And the third word, because I think few means three, and that's all I said I would say, is connector. And the phenomenon of connector, I think, has probably existed as long as humans have walked the earth. Malcolm Gladwell, I think, at least he's credited with giving that appellation to it, is a person who transcends many different social and professional networks and ties people together, brings them together in the right way, in the right time, in the right place. You're probably familiar with the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon phenomenon. That's a pretty difficult parlor game to play, but it's pretty easy to play the game with Pam. All of us here are 1 degree from Pam, and in theory that makes us 2 degrees from each other. And I have one of the great privileges of serving on the Board of Advisors for Children and Screens, and having come to the last Congress and to this one is having the extraordinary opportunity to have Pam connect me with all of the people that she has connected me with. And I know I speak for many of you too, because there are many people in this room who I only know, whose work I've known, but who I only know as individuals through Pam. So I think those 3 words for me are what really come to mind when I think of Pam. And with that, I would like to bring a visionary, relentless connector to speak to us and open the Congress. Pam.
That was very sweet of you. Supposed to wear this. Can everybody hear me? Should I turn off this mic or? Okay. I don't know what to say about that. I'll get you back later. Good evening and welcome to the 2nd Digital Media and Developing Minds National Congress. On behalf of Children and Screens, co-host Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, and our entire Congress Committee, thank you for joining us. I look forward to learning from all of you. It's been 3 years since our first National Congress. This anniversary calls not only for celebration, but also for reflection on the past and preparation for the future. So for the next few minutes, I'd like to consider where we've come from, where we are, and where we're going. So why are we here? The issues that concern us are so global and so ubiquitous that it's tempting to answer this in terms of vast abstractions. But for me, one need look no further than everyday interactions we've all observed between children and media. We've all seen a compliment online make our teens' day, while a critical posting or exclusion brings self-doubt and tears. We've seen children physically together, but worlds apart, as they wordlessly type into their devices. We've checked in on a school night, hoping to find our teen asleep, but instead finding the blue glow of a phone under her blanket. And we've observed 3- and 4-year-olds asking Alexa if they can have candy for dinner. As parents and adults, we can discuss and share these stories, but as researchers, clinicians, and educators, we must do more. We must ask what our science tells us about this. There are real children, real families, and communities behind the data, and their well-being depends on this science, depends on us, depends on you. That is our collective origin story. That is why we are here. We have come to answer the 3 fundamental questions with which I opened the first National Congress 3 years ago in 2015. They remain just as relevant today. First, how are digital media enhancing or impairing children's ability to live happy, healthy, and productive lives? Second, how are years of electronically mediated interactions shaping children's physical, cognitive, psychological, social, emotional, and behavioral development? And third, what should we do about it? So where do we stand now? What progress have we made to refine, amplify, and expand upon the insights and objectives we identified in the first Congress? In 2017, Pediatrics, the Journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, published the special supplement Children, Adolescents, and Screens, What We Know and What We Need to Learn. Its 22 articles reflected the work of over 100 named authors from many academic disciplines. Children and Screens initiated, organized, and funded that project and gratefully acknowledges all those that collaborated on it. You can find copies outside at our bookstore. Also last year, the National Institute on Drug Abuse sponsored a workshop on social media, mobile technology, and youth risk behaviors. It explored the relationship among media exposure, data analytics, and the promotion of healthier choices and better outcomes. Earlier this year, Media Exposure and Early Childhood Development Workshop at Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Development continued the process of shaping future research. In addition to NICHD and Children and Screens sponsors included NIH, Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research, the National Science Foundation, the Society for Research in Child Development, and the American Psychological Association. Just this month, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences published a number of papers drawn directly from the first National Congress, of which NAS was a co-sponsor, as you've heard. In his introductory essay, the University of Michigan's David Meyer eloquently described the state of the art in our field. He wrote, "The rigorous study of digital media and child development has had relatively little time to progress. Much of the new methodology needed for advancing this field still has to be fully conceived and implemented. Hence, extant empirical findings, conceptual hypotheses, and theoretical formalisms in this domain are still relatively rudimentary to date." I don't consider this to be a criticism. I consider it to be a call to action. 2016 policy statements from the American Academy of Pediatrics supplied guidance to parents and practitioners. With these, the AAP reminded us of our collective responsibility to pediatricians and other clinicians. We must empower them to identify not only media-related opportunities and risks for children in general, but also each child's particular needs. That will be our contribution to the age of precision medicine. The World Health Organization recently took another step forward. the WHO included gaming disorder as a diagnostic category in the 11th revision of its International Classification of Diseases. The WHO based this decision on its, quote, reviews of available evidence and a consensus of experts from different disciplines and geographical regions. The extent of that consensus will become clearer when the American Psychiatric Association makes its own final determination about Internet gaming disorder. The most recent edition of the APA's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5, defines Internet gaming disorder, but includes it only as a, quote, condition for further study. That is, the APA has not determined whether or not Internet gaming disorder is a unique mental disorder, but it has identified criteria for further study. The DSM-5 language had its intended effect. It has inspired 5 years of further research. As a scientist, I appreciate that methodological, credible, persuasive studies take time. But as a parent and child health advocate, 5 years strikes me as a very long time in the life of a child or a family in distress. On the public policy front, pending legislation justifies cautious optimism. The First National Congress called for a coherent, coordinated, and comprehensive program of multidisciplinary youth media effects research under the National Institutes of Health auspices. The recently introduced Children and Media Research Advancement Act, the CAMERA Act, answers that call. Children and Screens has endorsed the CAMERA Act, but our enthusiasm is tempered by two concerns. First, some version or another of this bill has been introduced in Congress several times before, but never enacted into law. Congress and the White House may fail us again. Second, even if the CAMERA Act becomes law, its mandate will require more money than the bill provides. Additional money from businesses and philanthropy will be needed. Children and Screens is working to devise an appropriate collaborative funding model. I invite you to join in this effort. CAMERA co-sponsor Senator Edward Markey will be addressing us on video tomorrow. With or without the CAMERA Act, the companies monetizing young audiences can be important funding sources for academic research. We must be vigilant, however, about our intellectual independence. Neither corporate donors nor their captive nonprofits can be allowed to influence researchers' decisions about what questions to ask and how to pursue, interpret, and disseminate the answers. Be vigilant about discovering and disclosing the ultimate sources of your own research grants. Doing so will protect the credibility of your findings. There's been a lot of news about that recently. The positive force of collaboration is not just influencing academia and Capitol Hill. Socially conscious investors are displaying it too. Earlier this year, JANA Partners and the Cal State Teachers Retirement System wrote to Apple's board of directors. They asked Apple to, quote, offer parents more choices and tools to help them ensure that young consumers are using its products in an optimal manner. The tone of their letter is as interesting as its content. It is a firm but well-informed, restrained, specific, and pragmatic call for dialogue. For example, JANA and Cal State teachers argue that, quote, it is both unreasonable and poor long-term business strategy to ask parents to fight this battle alone. Imagine the goodwill Apple can generate with parents by partnering with them in this effort and the next generation of customers by offering their parents more options to protect their health and well-being. In its response, Apple defended its business practices but acknowledged the need for additional child safety features. It released a number of them just 6 months later. Is this a sign of things to come? I am cautiously optimistic. As the shareholders wrote to Apple in June, mobile device technology will continue to evolve, and the research around developmentally optimal usage will continue to come into sharper focus, meaning this must be an ongoing effort. I look forward to seeing more potential technologists and child advocates working together to identify, articulate, pursue, and achieve shared goals for children's health and welfare. So, how do we proceed from here? First, we must collaborate. We are engaged in a dazzlingly complex task. We are trying to understand what's happening at the point where three dynamic phenomena collide: rapidly evolving media, children racing through developmental stages, and a fluid social and cultural context. No one academic or professional discipline, and certainly no one lab or university, has all the tools needed to do this. That is why multidisciplinary, multi-institutional research was an organizing principle at the first National Congress, and why it is again at this one. Next, we must innovate while continuing to learn from elegantly designed, rigorously analyzed, and thoughtfully employed survey, diary, and interview-based studies. We now have the opportunity to complement existing tools and methodologies with new ones. We can more directly measure what children are doing, hearing, seeing, and feeling in real time, all the time, and through what physiological and neurological mechanisms. With our growing ability to create and manipulate such massive data sets, we may discover the cause and effect relationships, underlying mechanisms of action, differential risk and benefit susceptibilities, and personalized interventions toward which many in this room are working. Parents need more than general advice from us. They need empirically validated, actionable, and demonstrably effective guidelines for their children's media exposure. And finally, we must communicate, even about controversial issues, in measured and respectful terms. There will always be those who embrace confrontational approaches. Some will be drawn to the simplicity of technophilia and technophobia. Others will employ such extremist views because they produce usefully provocative and distracting sound bites, tools for exploiting divisive problems rather than solving them. We cannot yield the field to them. The first Digital Media and Developing Minds National Congress and ensuing events have shown that there is a better way. The disciplinary, institutional, and philosophical diversity of this Second National Congress confirms it. So too does the breadth of our agenda. It continues many of the conversations that we began in 2015, but also includes many important topics that received little or no attention. We have assembled all the ingredients needed for 4 days of evidence-based, collaborative, multidisciplinary problem solving, and for years more of productive research and influential discourse. All that remains is for you to ignite this engine of discovery. Please be generous with your expertise this week. Be open to insights from unexpected sources. Be imaginative about the potential of unlikely partnerships. Be curious. Be engaged. Find people who know and do things that you don't, who ask questions different from yours. Invite them to sit with you at lunch. Something exciting is sure to happen. I hope you'll let me know when it does. Thank you for being here. I look forward to spending this time with you. Now we have a film, and then Justine Cassell was going to be our first keynote.
When we think of the future, we naturally think of what new technology will define that time. How will we live? What will we be able to do? What will it impact? More importantly, who will be there to experience and drive that future? The answer is our children. Children play an active role in not only determining which technologies catch on, but which define us as a society. The digital world is driven by complex forces, and youth is shaping its condition, perspective, and potential every day. But how is this new world affecting the building blocks of human development? What do we celebrate, and what do we be wary of? Looking ahead, what do we study, and how do we study it? Does the future paradigm include screens, texting, or even social media? If we want to learn more about ourselves, more about how human nature shapes and informs technology, we needn't look very far.
Proceeding thoughtfully toward the future is impossible without a thorough understanding of the current state of things. It's about how do we acquire enough understanding about our situation in order to make good choices about what comes next.
You know, children born today, they're not just digital natives, they're AI natives, right? They're living in a world, growing up in a world where they have always been able to interact with intelligent machines.
When people created the first computers, they already started to think about how to create intelligent machines for cracking codes, for simulating physical phenomena. So we're seeing this rapid acceleration, this exponential growth in AI as machines not only learn from exponentially growing data, but they're also growing by teaching each other.
My hope is that with timely introduction of and effective education about interactive media, young people will learn to use these digital devices as tools, not toys.
We'll move toward using media in much more intentional, thoughtful, and careful ways. This will invite all of us to be much more alert to and prepared to navigate the truly thorny situations and dilemmas that I think increasingly come up in our connected lives.
I've seen how swiftly children are able to adopt features of technology to cater to their own needs and wants.
Technologies can't be beneficial all by themselves, and much depends on how parents interact with children around digital contents and services and how schools embed these in their teaching. So our social norms need to change, and they will.
We know that we are increasingly living in an AI-enabled world, and we risk a future potentially where AI is really creating more of a divide.
There's a lot of people who worry about AI getting out of hand, and there's a lot of doomsday scenarios around AI. I think AI will evolve to be different. It doesn't experience the world the way we experience it. We'll know things we don't know, we'll know things that the AI can't perceive, and it's going to be like a different species.
My concern is that we will continue to use these tools thoughtlessly. Instead of building on the science that we have and continue to collect, to use these tools in ways that increase our knowledge, improve our communication, and enhance our humanity.
How much connection is too much? What is the boundary between authenticity and oversharing? And what do we do about tensions over hate speech versus free speech on social media?
What I really fear is that big business will increasingly track, collate, and monetize every digital trace left by children. All our thinking about parental mediation and teaching media literacy has centered on intervening between the child and the screen. Now we need a whole new approach to both critical literacy and child rights respecting regulation. Through the whole of history, children have prioritised play, learning, family and friends. They're born believing the world is fair, and they value their agency and belonging above all else.
I certainly believe that with care, expertise and ethical conscience we can make the best out of media for future childhoods. But it will be a continuous challenge.
If I look forward, there's still milestones that are coming our way. Machines that generate things, generate images, generate music, generate art.
We just look at the realities of, the future we're going into and the kinds of skills that children need to learn. How can we, harness these technologies to bring, about greater social justice and things as basic as, can every child have access to a high quality education? There is so much good that can be done.
The future lies in the children. If we keep their health and development foremost in our minds when we make decisions, we will all move toward a better future.
So I'm frustrated. I feel like we're really having the same conversation we had when we talked about television and children, and the same conversation we were having when we talked about the telegraph and young women, and the same conversation we had when we talked about trains and young women. Same conversation that priests had when they talked about the effect of the printing press on religion. And it really bugs me. So when I started out writing this talk, I started out writing a talk about all the ways that technology can be good for young people. And I have a lot of evidence from 25 years of my own work in this area. And I thought, that's kind of boring. I mean, yeah, it's cool. Everyone goes, ooh, ah, wow, cool. But that's just as easy as saying, oh my God, no, eh. How do we get out of that either or? And going back to my own background, I mean, I work as a technologist now, but I have a PhD in developmental psych and a PhD in linguistics from a place where we were always told, you don't have to espouse any particular theory. We'll give you the rope. You either build a ladder out or you hang yourselves. So I was thinking back to my own training and thinking what we're missing here is a way of parameterizing or thinking through what it is we're doing. Not whether it's good or bad, but how we think about it. And so I went back to where our metaphors of technology come from. And Linkletter was a very important person in this. And he said, our hope is in not too many years, brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, and the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought and process data in a way not approached by the information handling machines we know today. He spoke both from the perspective of a cognitive psychologist and a computer scientist, and his perspective was incredibly powerful, incredibly influential. It seems natural, normal, what could be wrong with it? Well, it seems to me that that cognitive psychology that he proposed in 1960 has really stuck us in a corner of a science of a middle-aged white man sitting at a computer thinking through a math problem all by himself. And that was the birth of the kinds of computers that we study today. Now, obviously, it's evolved. But I wonder if we're not stuck in that paradigm. I wonder if we're not thinking about middle-aged white men as our audience, or children growing into middle-aged white men. Some gender reassignment's going to be needed for some of us. Sitting at a computer as opposed to playing with fabric or toys or the cloud. Thinking as opposed to feeling or sensing or moralizing or relating to one another. And working on math problems as opposed to telling stories or growing, finding a friend, making the world a better place. And always alone as opposed to a dyad, a society, or a collection of neurons. So what would happen if we parameterize this? And I do have to say, I am not just a cautious optimist, but an enthusiastic optimist. And Pat Greenfeld said in the bathroom, I said I loved her talk last time I heard her. She was incredibly negative, and she said, well, you're incredibly optimistic. Someone has to take the other side. And it's true that I am optimistic, but I'm optimistic because I am incredibly self-efficacious and agentive. I am not a futurist. I am a scientist. The future's not going to come. We're going to make it happen one way or the other by what we buy, by what we study, what we build, what we teach our children, what we prevent our children from doing. So what if we broke this down and looked at a new model where we got rid of each of these a priori, each of these presuppositions about what the computer was defined to be, what a screen was defined to mediate between on the one side and on the other side. A new parameterization of who, that is what population, what, that is the task, what units of analysis we use, is it alone, and what it is used to do. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And the examples are not exciting examples. I actually tried to excise all the ooh-ahs. It's from, in many places, my own old work. But I hope it's going to get us to think in a way about how we get out of a pure good or a pure bad by thinking through what we're doing, for whom, why, and how, for every decision we make, in the studies we carry out, and the technologies that we implement. So the first one is, why do we assume, why have we assumed since 1960 that the basis that we're working from is the task? Because hasn't that led us to this kind of notion? The birth of, what was it? Luckily, MOOCs kind of came and went, and now I forget. But it was the best thing ever to happen to education. And I always thought, yeah, just like the film strip. But there's a lot of film strips in drawers and cupboards. So is this the best thing to happen to education? This is clearly something that comes from a white man or a white boy sitting alone at a computer working on a math problem. But it carries with it an unexamined, extremely old-fashioned notion of what learning is, that we are empty vessels, tabula rasa, into which knowledge is poured. We know that that's not the case, and yet somehow when we adopt new tools, we turn back to very old models of pedagogy. So we know, for example, that education is far more likely to come from curiosity, from argument, from interaction, from mental, from cognitive buttings of heads. And so I wondered whether the computer, rather than teaching, when we seat children in front of screens, those screens could not teach but evoke. How do they evoke? And what skills could they evoke in the doing of tasks that may lead to learning but not be pouring of knowledge? And I started reading with my students, Jen Bai, postdoc, who's now faculty at Rochester, and Bhargavi Paranjap, who's a second-year master's student, very talented second-year master's student. We started reading about curiosity, some of the other socio-emotional skills that are so predictive of learning and that are increasingly part of what we expect schools to do. The 21st century job skills, the next gen skills that we expect our children to learn. A lot of them are socio-emotional learning, like curiosity. And there's a lot of literature on curiosity. Curiously, though, none of that extant literature covers anything social about the nature of curiosity, which is curious, because curiosity starts when we are face-to-face with an environment and with others. And so what role do those others play? And what could a screen play in the bringing and curiosity in a social context? So my students and I always look at these things the same way. We always carry out as ecologically valid a experiment as we can in the absence of any technology to find out what kids do when they're left alone, and then to try and use technology as a way of bootstrapping that happens naturally. And that's really interesting to me because when I think about the bad, and you saw that in the video that we watched, the bad is often phrased as that which is external to the child. Now, kids have a lot of bad in them. Any of you who have children know that kids have a lot of bad in them. They have bullying, they have obstinacy, they also have a lot of good in them. How do we use technology then, not as something external to the child, but as something that draws out those most positive of characteristics, such as curiosity? So we started watching groups of kids. We asked them to build a Rube Goldberg machine. You give them pipe cleaners, paper towel, and cups and stuff. Ask the machine down which a marble can roll. And you get a lot of interaction and a lot of talk. And we looked at a lot of those things, and I am going to really rush through this, but if you're interested, we have a lot of papers on this, most recently in AI for Education and the International Conference on the Learning Sciences, and then upcoming in the Intelligent Virtual Agents Conference. What we discovered was, using machine learning tools to mine the data, that my action at time 1 is less predictive of my curiosity at time 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 than is Pam's action at time 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. That is, other children's actions are more predictive of the level of curiosity than are our own actions. And yet there's no description of this in the literature, and there's certainly no technology that takes advantage of it. So we've been doing this research for quite some time, and we've been able to build what are called temporal association rules, another kind of machine learning that can predict a level of curiosity at what comes before. And we're using that to build a system that will evoke those most predictive aspects of curiosity in the form of a virtual child who can play a game with real children to evoke their curiosity. And I should say I'm working here with the very talented faculty member Jessica Hammer, who's a game designer. And she's the one who's built this game, which is a game that focuses on getting children to enumerate hypotheses and adduce evidence for them. And what we're discovering then is that not just the task of linear algebra or math or science, but the very task of loving to learn, the very task of becoming a lifelong learner, the skill of wanting to discover, which is what predicts lifelong learning, can be evoked from computers, not just math problems sitting alone. So as you can tell, I'm moving really quickly through this. Populations, it's not just a single person, and it's not just a white man. Look at the literature on children's development. It was really very recently that we stopped looking at middle-class white kids' language development, for example, middle-class white kids' typical development, really remarkably recently comparatively. And it was striking to me when I look at articles on technology for children how non-diverse the group of children is that we're designing for and the group of children that we're watching. Whether that's one single child as opposed to a group of children. And this picture is of a young woman putting a photo of herself on Instagram. And it's a very singular activity in every meaning of the word singular. It can be quite stressful. Personally, I don't think it's any more stressful than the things that I did in high school in order to get the equivalent of likes from the peer group that I was not a part of. But whether or not you believe that, it's an activity that's solitary, although oriented. And I contrast it with a program that I ran 20 years ago, 1998, where we gathered more than 3,000 children from 139 countries online. And it was a very big undertaking. I learned how to sneak computers into the developing world in a big old Samsonite suitcase that I pretended had summer dresses in it. Once it fell on my foot, and I had the choice between revealing the fact that it had this huge computer tower in it or getting through customs, because we would put the computers in and they would never come out the other side of the X-ray machine magically. And I did learn how to do that. I learned how to bribe officials to get phone lines run to small villages. In any case, 3,062 children joined this from 139 countries, and you see some of them listed here. And we were very proud of the amount of data we had. When I first went to talk to Facebook about this, they cuttingly said, "We gather that every second." And that was 10 years ago. That's not even the case today, and they weren't in the slightest anything that I had to say after that. But I have to say that the beauty of this is, first of all, small data are important. Big data is gone for anybody in machine learning or anybody in artificial intelligence. Our behaviors, the behaviors of ours that are interesting, are not common. And deep learning algorithms are not ready for that yet. There's my technological stake in the ground. So we did this very small data, old-fashioned kind of research, and 5 years later, Donna Tversky, my research assistant, and I went around the world, and we went to 21 countries and followed up with the kids. And we looked at self-efficacy, agentivity, and self-esteem. Now, of course, there's no control condition here. That was impossible. But we did find that kids from environments where no one ever expected were doing things that no one ever expected them to do. And this is a young woman who posted this picture just a few weeks ago. She's a barrister in Dhaka, Bangladesh. She grew up under a folded tin in the slums of Dhaka. She shared a bed that they had found in a trash can, and they had found this piece of tin which they dragged over their bed and they cooked outside. No one expected her to end up anywhere other than that same piece of tin. And yet she went to high school, she went to college, and she's now a lawyer, which is really extraordinary. And as I say, there's no control condition. But wouldn't it be nice if we kept that in mind? And I think it was Cynthia Brazil who said in the video, no, or Holt maybe, I don't remember who it was, said we have to keep in mind children's health. We have to keep in mind what we want from children. And there is no reason for us to design or to buy or to support for the sharing of sects or beautiful filtered pictures of ourselves rather than communities that instead move to change the world like this one did. And I can tell you more about that after, but these 3,062 children built a country. They lobbied the UN for into the UN for a country whose geography and whose citizenship requirements were age. They got an interview with Noam Chomsky, and so on and so forth. And they did change the world, and they continue to change the world. Another aspect of that is identity. And we all know that identity and identity formation is probably what we spend the most time working on as we grow. As a developmental stage, it comes back over and over again in different iterations. And yet, very little technology is intentionally built to support the work of identity formation. On the contrary, most technology that's used for identity formation is the technology that parents would like their children not to use, like Instagram, because it is a place where children try out alternate versions of themselves. We wanted to play with this notion in a positive way, and so we took on an extremely political topic, and that is the use of mainstream dialects in the classroom. We were a postdoc who was working with me and a graduate student called me sobbing down the phone and said, "Are you going to let us back in the lab?" They were thrown out, as well as was all their equipment, because they were using technology that was speaking in the African American vernacular used by the particular community that they were working in. And we had done a linguistic grammar of that particular dialect in that particular community. We simply pitted two hypotheses against one another. One hypothesis says that as part of our work in schools, we are forming an identity, and that our affiliation with our home community is as important, at least as important, as our affiliation with our school identity in the learning endeavor. And that is, children must be allowed to speak dialect because it is such a visible cue of affiliation with a supportive community. And the other hypothesis says children need to be helped to be lifted up out of a situation of poverty and ignorance, mainstream English because it's the code of power. From mainstream English is going to allow children to think that's okay and is going to lose them to class travel to the middle and middle upper class. We pitted those two hypotheses against one another really simply. One virtual child spoke mainstream English only, and one spoke African American vernacular while brainstorming with the child, and then said, "My teacher likes it when I speak mainstream English," and switched. That was the only difference between the two. Children who worked with the bidialectal agent, and this was work by Samantha Finkelstein for her PhD, children who worked with the bidialectal agent, which was roughly 3 minutes different than the mainstream agent. 3 minutes of brainstorming using dialect, and then both of them spoke mainstream for the presentation to the teacher. Those 3 minutes led to a higher use of science discourse, that is, hypotheses, evidence, reasons for what the children said. But it turned out that was not really what was going on, because the before. So the children felt affiliation with the agent that code switched, that spoke the vernacular and then switched to the mainstream. And that affiliation led them to do better on science. I want to point out here, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that a lot of things are going on in these classrooms that are going to need a lot more work than simply sticking an agent in there that code switches. We asked children to tell us whether they thought the agent was smart, and they said no because she speaks ghetto. No, she didn't sound smart because she didn't speak proper. No, she needs a little more grammar lesson because she talks like 10 bug, which is 10 bugs. And this is in a classroom where the teacher, who told us that all cultures are equally accepted in her classroom, that the population is as important as the task, was overheard saying to the children, "You speak like the street, you'll end up back in the street." So, what are these screens? When I were talking on the phone the other day, she said, is there even a screen between us? And Anya Kamenetz has written about this in her most recent book, that if AR and VR are getting rid of this screen, and this is something that I've been trying to do for a long time. There can be interactive books, there can be augmented quilts, construction toys, stuffed animals, why there can even be a tower. So isn't this a great example of something without a screen? The problem with Alexa, for me, is not whether or not she says please or thank you. Not even whether or not, to be provocative, she's collecting everything you and your children say. The thing that's really problematic is that the children are listening, not speaking. And that is not healthy. Because once again, children are not vessels. We learn by struggling with and struggling against. So children hacking Alexa, that's healthy. This is one, to be provocative, this is one of many, many school children showing how to hack Alexa and how to hack a Kindle and an iPad so that your parents' password will be automatically filled in and you can turn off the filters your parents have put on the device. You can look it up for yourself if you'd like. It's very easy to do, turns out. So when we thought about this, we thought about how we could construct technology that listened to children. And this is that parameterization of what the computer is. This is a series of computers that look like toys, stuffed animals. Children themselves decided who they were talking to. They attributed an identity to the toy. In one that was called SAGE, the Story Agent Generation Environment, children themselves decided what wise old person they needed to talk to. I'm going to go quickly over this because really this is similar to what I was telling you before, that we often think about learning as a solitary activity, and learning isn't a solitary activity. What happens when you have a misunderstanding and it with a different understanding, and you have to butt heads between those two. So this is new work that we're currently evaluating, where we actually for 4 long years studied children peer tutoring. We looked at their self-disclosure behaviors, their praise behaviors. Actually, there's only 12 behaviors in almost 3,000 hours of data for this particular age group. Teasing, insulting, we found that children who insult one another learn more math. And we've been building technologies. They don't quite insult yet, although they do sometimes tease, and they do a lot of negative self-disclosure. In the interest of time, I'm not going to show you the video, but what we're finding is that children know how to produce teaching that is not face-threatening for other children. And so once again, why are we looking at the future of technology as being things that fill up our children, rather than that challenge them and listen to them? And finally, the question, Sherry Turkle and I have had this argument for a very long time about whether relationship building with objects is a bad thing. I think she's saying that our hearts are small and have a limited amount of room. And I don't agree. I think our hearts are large And I think the more we love, the more capacity we have to love. And I've seen that in technology that my students and I have built with children with autism spectrum disorder, where they are able to form bonds if the immediacy of the interaction is not as hot or not as difficult as it is with other children. So I'm going to finish up, and this is, as I said, not a lot of glitzy stuff, but I hope it's a way of pushing you to think about why we build what we build, what metaphors we use, and how they're controlling what we do, and how we feel positively about it or negatively about it. You can believe that these technologies are the end of make-believe, or you can believe that they're mirrors that we give to ourselves and to our representations of we may not be very happy about. Are they, in fact, the sign of a kind of moral panic about who we have become? And for that reason, we're truly scared. So I'm going to stop here. I think that if we're going to get out of this stuck place, we need to reparameterize what technology is, not in terms of screens or not screens, but in terms of developmental stages: identity formation, construction, peer relationships, appropriation. Those skills that we hope our children acquire, even if it's appropriation of our password to remove the filters from Alexa. And I just want to end by saying there's something that I don't hear us discussing here, and I've been lucky enough to be part of a group that has just started a nonprofit called Equal AI. Equal AI is a nonprofit that looks at ways to diminish some of the unintentional bias brought about by learning tools in artificial intelligence. We're looking at algorithmic bias, that is, the nature of the data that we use and how it unintentionally constrains what we build. We're looking at bias in hiring, and we're looking at bias in representation. That is, whether the toys and tools we build say things like Siri does when I say, "Go away, Siri," and she says, "Oh, couldn't we just be friends?" So that kind of bias is quite powerful. So I think that if the future of technology is going to be bright, we can't sit around predicting it. We have to make it happen, and we have to think about it with a developmental lens. Thank you.
I told you it wasn't going to be the same. Thank you very much, Justine. It's now my privilege to, I'm not going to be introducing everyone every time because we don't have a lot of time, but to introduce James Griffin, who's the Deputy Development and Behavior Branch from the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development from NICHD of the National Institutes of Health. Welcome.
Can you hear me okay? All right. Good evening. I'm Jim Griffin, as you heard, from the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. I was enjoying Dr. Castle's talk very much, and then I realized why I was invited, because I'm a middle-aged white man, and I'm in real trouble now. It's the end of that. No. Oh good, the slides are up, yay, okay. No, I am here from the National Institutes of Health, and I do want to say, first of all, thank Pam for the invitation to be here. And I will tell you more reasons a little later why I have additional reasons to be grateful to her. I have to say the typical disclaimer, which is the views presented are not necessarily those. The National Institutes of Health, the US Department of Health and Human Services, or Kanye West. With that, this was supposed to advance. Oh, and it did. Okay, great. Okay, NIH. We're the world's largest supporter of biomedical, behavioral, and social science research. Our budget for this fiscal year, just started October 1st, is $39.2 billion. It's like a $2 billion increase. If I was Congress, I would have added the extra 800 million, let us get to 40 billion even, but no, I mean, we won't complain. Specifically though, I'm from the NICHD. And I really like to talk about our mission statement briefly because I really like our mission statement. I don't know a lot of people can say that. But it is that every person is born healthy and wanted. Women suffer no harmful effects from reproductive processes. All children have the chance to achieve their full potential for healthy and productive lives, free from disease or disability, and to ensure the health, productivity, independence, and well-being of all people through optimal rehabilitation. Boy, if we could do all that, what a difference we can make. And that's why, as I say, I'm very, very happy that I work at NICHD. With that, I do want to point out that we're actually in a strategic planning process. The first meeting of a working group met today, actually, and is meeting tomorrow. But it's underway under the direction of our director, Dr. Diana Bianchi. And it's really to, I'm not going to read all this, but it's really to allow us to look at our portfolio and decide where we may need to do some changes or to refocus our science, encouraging new partnerships and collaborations. It is possible for everyone here to join a strategic planning webinar October 31st. You do need to pre-register, and if these slides go out, you can just click on the link. But the easiest thing to do is just Google NICHD Strategic Planning. You'll get to it. The same thing, you can also email your questions or ideas to the address right there. I'm from the Child Development Behavior Branch. And I put this up here just so you can get a sense. I'm not going to, again, go through all of these, but the breadth of what we cover. And this is just one branch within the Institute. But hopefully you will see the relevance to what we bring to this topic. And my specific portfolio is in early learning and school readiness. It's actually, I am in, 26 years of federal service. Started out doing Head Start research and evaluation work. Went over to the Department of Education when they started doing early childhood education, now doing it with NICHD. It's all been in the same area. And you have to remember, 26 years ago, most people didn't remember that Head Start even existed. There were no such things as state preschool programs. Even childcare wasn't really that much of a topic of consideration. Look at where we are later, and a lot of the gains that have been made have been because of research that's been done. So I mean, it really speaks to the power of what can be achieved with systematic research. I do want to point out, because you're going to be hearing about a workshop in a minute, my colleagues Ruben Alvarez, who does our language bilingualism and biliteracy program, was extremely helpful on this topic, as was our branch chief, Lisa Freund, who does cognitive development, behavioral neuroscience, and psychobiology. So, you know, the talk is kind of minding the gap. And it's always dreary to talk about what we don't know or gaps in the knowledge. So I really wanted to start off by something we do know. And that is that the brain is still a mystery. Well, now hold it. That's saying something we don't know. Well, we know a lot more than we used to. But I think it's always good to start off with the fact that we really are still, in the infancy of understanding our brain and how we connect what we know about the brain with actual cognition, with behavior. imaging advances are going a long way to helping unlock a lot of those mysteries. We literally are doing, imaging with infants now. It's really, the people who are doing this work are making incredible advances, and we'll talk more about how those may feed into advances in this area. Again, what do we know? Brain growth. It's amazing. Again, I won't go all this, but at birth, what we have in terms of neurons are pretty much what we have, 100 billion. By age 2, the brain is 80% of the adult size. So, what keeps growing? Other cells like glia, and the neuron connections. 1,000 trillion connections by age 3. Now, one thing, I'm talking and using a developmental lens, and I'm focusing on early childhood, but it doesn't mean a lot of this isn't relevant to the adolescent work. So I'm hoping that all of you and the speakers who are really looking at pre-adolescent and the adolescent will continue to really be thinking about the foundations that are laid here, but then what the implications are for the continuities and discontinuities and the developmental trajectories that they're seeing, and both looking forward and backward. That's what we really need to do to be able to understand a lot of these issues. It's really important, I know this is obvious, but I think it's important to point out, experience can change the actual structure of the brain. It's activity dependent. Some neural circuits are excited, others are not. There's a lot of pruning that goes, that takes place in the first 3 years. So a lot of it is about the efficiency of those connections. And that's the one thing that we always like to talk about. Certainly, we all retain plasticity. Everyone in this room could learn a new language. Doesn't matter how old you are, given different circumstances. It's just perhaps going to take a lot more time and effort. Just as the case intervening in the preschool period versus intervening later in an educational trajectory, it's often much more efficient to do it earlier than it is later. It's still possible, it's just time intensive and a lot of work. And again, a lot of that may be due to the efficiencies. So thinking about what's going on in early development and then how it's laying the foundation for later behaviors. So the social basis for early brain development. Obviously, we know that the early experiences create brain neuron connections. Parent-child interactions are key. And again, that progression from a secure attachment to self-regulation. How an infant basically learns to make its way in the world to regulate its own behavior is mediated through the interaction with parents, caregivers, others in the environment. So how do nurturing parents and caretakers do this? In infancy, the parent often will act out what the infant can't do. Physical actions, verbal communication, directing attention. I mean, I know some of this is kind of obvious, but again, I want to underscore it because enter electronic media. And now we have to really understand how this is now basically what role it has. The disruptive role, the adaptive role, the potentiating role. We really need to understand more about how all of this is affecting what's going on with parenting and with child development. Now, what are the 3 things an infant toddler can't resist? Mom. I know dads, but it's mom. Car keys. Car keys are big. And cell phones with touch screens. I mean, I think, I don't know how many people here have infants, toddlers, grandchildren, whatever, but they literally sell the little toy iPhones that are decoys, so you don't have to give your infant your actual iPhone, have them slobber on it, drop it on the phone, break it, or whatever. They're really, really motivating. And it's not just a matter of, futzing around. There's learning going on with those. Now, this brings us to the topic that I referred to before, which is, and Pam mentioned, we had a workshop at NICHD that we hosted on media exposure and early child development. It was in January. And there was over 50 outside experts, federal staff, and scientific organization representatives. The real idea of the workshop was to look at what we know about basic and translational research. It wasn't focused on policy. It wasn't looking at practice guidelines. It was really to understand how media, and I'll just use media, is affecting developmental trajectories of young children. What we know and what we don't know, minding the gap. Again, sincere thanks to Pam and the other sponsors and my fellow coworkers. And I really want to point out many of the following points in terms of the research gaps and promising directions are derived from the workshop. And the executive summaries available online. Again, I'm assuming at some point slides will be available, but you can just Google NICHD workshop, media exposure, you'll get to it. So research gaps. I think the first one, and again, it dovetails, I think, very nicely with what we've already heard so far, is the relationship between brain development and electronic media exposure. How are we using our current tools? One of the things that was discussed at the workshop was the real dearth of studies using EEG, MRI in the second year, age 2, really was pretty non-existent. I think there's maybe a little bit more, but we really need to do more in this area. And the same thing about using functional MRI, being able to do that with children. I know they're actually doing some fMRI work with sleeping infants. And I think that work is absolutely fascinating. But again, a lot of that is on the very basic level. I think there's a lot more that can be done even earlier on with children interacting with media. I don't know if you know how you do this with an fMRI. With the scanner, with infants, it's an MRI. But you literally bring them in at night, feed them, wait till they fall asleep, put them in the scanner. If they wake up, they come out of the scanner. It's very, very patient work. Once they're older and you can actually start doing tasks, how do you get them to be still? You put them in the fMRI, and you put a little video on. And if the child moves their head, the video stops. And they learn really very quickly to lay still because they want to watch the video. But then it also, if you think about it, you have the perfect methodology in place for being able to study some of the things we're interested in. There are new imaging methods like MEG and other methodologies and innovations that are rapidly developing that we can start extending some of this work down with infants and toddlers. Learning. Again, this has already been touched on, but I'm going to again emphasize it. What can infants and toddlers learn from touchscreen interactions? What about preschoolers? And I really emphasize the touchscreens because, again, I think there's a point, where we had television, but with the touchscreens, it adds a dimension to it. And there is an interactive quality that I think is just different. And as we start moving into some of the other technologies that are certainly already here now in terms of virtual reality and things of that nature, we're going to go more into this realm. And I don't think we again, unfortunately, the technology always seems to outrun our knowledge. We maybe just are getting a really better handle on TV, and now TV's passé. It's like kids are not watching television the way they used to, or it's certainly asynchronous. They don't wait till 3 o'clock till the show's on. They pull their tablet out and they call up whatever they want to watch when they want to watch it. How does learning from media affect representation in the world? Does the pathway the information is received matter? These are the kinds of really basic questions that, some people, including people in this room, are doing some really beautiful work on. But I think there's a lot of those questions that we still don't know. And again, how do passive interactions with media differ from active ones when it comes to learning? These are the types of questions that, again, from the very early ages on, I think we're struggling with. And I think some of it is the real challenge Dr. Castle already has underlined, but I think they're the types of questions that if we don't get better answers to, it's going to be hard to move forward. Social emotional development. How are early parent-child, family, peer, and community relationships shaped by media exposure? It really is a whole new world. I mean, we know from infants who are constantly watching the adults in their lives, looking at their cell phones and their tablets. I mean, that alone is a very important and a predictive cue. But again, think about it. As these children grow up now, it's just really, in some ways, a whole new world. How are virtual and in-person interactions integrated into sense of self and social skill development? And again, I would refer back to the first talk. I mean, if you think about it, children are now growing up in an electronic media age where, I mean, one of the things that is true is you can do anything online, you can be anyone online. But what does that do in terms of the developing sense of self and their understanding of their place in the world? And the same thing with social skill development. We know there's a lot of issues that go on now, certainly in the later ages, but as children are growing now, even at very young ages, they're going to be coming in with very different experiences in terms of their exposure to social media and their learning and their opportunities to do so. How is this going to impact their social skill development? Integration of research knowledge. What gaps in our knowledge must be addressed by basic research studies? These are ones often lab-based where we really need very controlled studies. Some of the neuroscience work, but also some of the really basic learning work, really you need to do in a controlled environment. But it's also true we need to know what gaps in our knowledge must be addressed by basic and translational research that's done in naturalistic settings. Sometimes very brief exposures in labs and pre-post type testing, sometimes even a little bit of a follow-up. We really also need to understand how well or those don't generalize to what's going on in the actual world. And also when it comes to the naturalistic settings, and I know we have vendors outside and many others will be talking about this, really understanding and capturing what's going on, the context with which the media are being consumed, the amount of time, and what, if anything, is actually being learned and retained. How can cross-sectional and longitudinal studies inform media effects on developmental trajectories? This is one that is a personal challenge for me because nothing drives me more crazy than when somebody takes a cross-sectional study and talks about it as a causal result. No. I think it's also really important, especially at whatever age ranges, that we really do understand sometimes when people will talk about studies, ages in range from 5 to 17. Developmentally, that's a universe of a lot of different developmental domains, and yet people just parse it out. They don't really necessarily pay enough attention. Often we need longitudinal studies, although I want to point out the cross-sectional studies can be very important to answer certain questions and to provide heuristics for longitudinal research. All right, so let's get to directions for future research. First of all, I just briefly mentioning need to leverage existing resources. This was one of the things that kept coming up at the workshop, is what data are either have been collected or being collected now that might be able to be used to look at some of these questions. Certainly right now NIH is funding the Baby Connectome, and some of that work is certainly on imaging in infancy and toddlerhood. If nothing else, the methodology, if not the work itself, is going to be directly relevant. We know I know at least one paper that's already come out from the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study, the ABCD study. Again, hopefully going to be a rich source of information. Same thing, we're planning right now a baby version of the ABCD, the Baby Brain and Cognitive Development Study. And again, it's a really natural platform to be able to integrate answers and collecting data on some of these questions. The environmental influences on child and health outcomes echo, and I know there are going to be some speakers who are going to be talking about these later on in the conference, so I won't say too much, except to say there are other data sets. There's also data platforms. Databrary is specifically a data archive set up for videotape data. And often it's collected for one purpose, but it can be analyzed for others. Family Life Project, Child Care Study, again, I'm going to be here, I'm going to keep moving, but at the same time, my point is there are secondary data analysis sources, and these are just NIH larger studies. There's many smaller studies, even sometimes randomized control trials, where information was collected that's relevant to electronic media exposure. It may not have been the point of the research, but they can be used. Measurement, capitalizing on, again, as I've already talked about, the imaging and other non-invasive technologies to link brain activity with behavior, using real-time embedded measures of media use, moving beyond simple parent report, real-world monitoring of media and use by parents, caregivers, including available tools. Again, everyone or anyone remember the V-chip from the 90s. It's still in all the TVs. Recently, somebody looked, of parents who even knew what the V-chip was, 25% are using it. And I mean, that's a very old technology, much less the newer ones that are being built now into tablets, smartphones. But are they being used, and how quickly does it take for the kids to defeat them? Okay, using technology to enable more inclusive research samples. This has already been touched on, but I really want to emphasize it because I think it really is something that we absolutely need to spend more attention on. We need a range of socioeconomic status samples, race, ethnicity, language minority children, and also parents and children with disabilities. These are often just not included in the samples, or they're certainly not something that we look at, and we really need to. Finally, the whole child. I think it's really important to bring all this back to the fact that all of this is going on in one child. And often as researchers, we study one little piece of it depending on our area, but we don't necessarily integrate it back together. We need to look at the impact on developmental trajectories of attachment and motion regulation, executive function, skill development, language acquisition, physical health and well-being, weight management, et cetera. All that's going on within the same child as they move forward, as they age. But often we tend to look at one, maybe two developmental domains at most. We need to really be looking at more together. Continuities and discontinuities in media exposure, and emerging exploration of play, behaviors, and creativity. Again, touched on, I think this is really important. What are the affordances of technology? How are we perhaps hindering this or displacing some of this because of media use? Emergence of school readiness skills and ability to function with same-age peer groups. Again, really very important. We know this is the case. Sometimes what is looked at in electronic media use and learning is very narrowly looked at, and we don't get a sense of the full range of skills, both school readiness skills as well as social skills with peers. Now, that's a lot. And you maybe have a little bit of anxiety, and that's okay. We will calm you down. We've got a couple more days of the workshop to work all this out. And has already been alluded to, sometimes we're going to have people who view electronic media very differently. And there's room for everybody, and we can get along. And I think it's really important that people do listen to each other, and it's fine to debate, and it doesn't mean you'll necessarily reconcile positions, but at the same time, I think it is important to do so in a respectful manner. With that, you can reach me, james.griffin@nih.gov, and I will be here. Thank you. Got it.
We have time for until 8:30 for some questions. We have people in the can come around with microphones. Anybody have any questions? Okay, thank you very much. And now I'd like to introduce the panel. No, here, you want to? Oh. You said we should all
Yeah, and for the final act of the evening, we have a panel on early childhood, and actually this will be, it's intended to be very interactive, so there'll be plenty of time for questions. Can the panelists please come up? Hopefully they're all here. Heather Krikorian will be standing in for Dr. Rachel Barr, whose plane was delayed. We have a very distinguished panel of early childhood media researchers, and my job is really to just play moderator way. So I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves briefly, and then I will ask them each one question, and that should leave plenty of time for the audience to engage both them and I think all of the content that we've discussed or that's been discussed earlier today. I can go over? Okay, well, we'll be here till 11:30 then. So just... Okay, you want to go first, Sarah? Oh, I don't know what order they're in. Whatever order the slides are in, just go ahead.
Well, I'm Rachel Barr, and I've been working. I wish I was.
I'm Rachel Barr.
Where do you have to go? I'm Rachel Barr.
I actually have her name tag. I was tempted to wear it, but I really didn't want to confuse everybody. I'm not Rachel Barr. I'm Heather Krikorian. I'm an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. But I'm filling in for Rachel Barr, whose flight was canceled. But she will be here later, so if you are looking forward to experiencing her brilliance and humor, you'll have a chance to do so later in the conference. She's on her way. So I'm filling in for Rachel because her flight was delayed, but also because she and I and others, including Sarah here with me, are in a collaborative consortium of sorts studying issues related to children and screens. So that's a quick intro about Rachel and me and why I'm here, and I'll talk more about that later.
Whoever's next on the slides. It is?
And the answer is?
Oh, that's it.
Sarah.
Sarah.
Oh, okay. Will you click it so the pictures show up? Okay, well, go back. Okay, hi, I am Sarah Coyne. I am a professor of developmental psychology at Brigham Young University. And I'm very honored to be in this panel because most of my existing work has been with adolescents. And I'm really interested in longitudinal research. So we have a 10-year longitudinal study called Flourishing Families in the Seattle area. Started at age 10, and they're now age 22. And as I've been doing this research, I realized that I'm studying not the wrong age group, but I need to be going much, much, much earlier if I really want to find out the true impact of media on children. So will you go to the next slide, and then just click all the buttons there too. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so I had this kind of vision that I wanted to kind of start at the very, very beginning and start in this brand new developmental period that I hadn't done a lot of research in. And so I was at the Children in the Screen conference a couple years ago with this idea, right? And I was on my way to the media violence seminar group, which is where I normally hang out. But there was an infant group, right? And I thought, I'm just gonna stop by and see what these people are like. And they're awesome. And so we developed this really great collaboration, like Heather said, called Cafe. And from that, right, sparked a study we call Project Media. Media stands for Media Effects on Development from Infancy to Adulthood. We'll see if we can get to that. And kind of this, right, pictures on my left, your right, show where we're at with Project Media. So we have a prenatal wave of about 200 babies. And my baby happens to be the exact same age as these kids, so he's kind of the little mascot here. And then wave 1, they're 6 months old about. We got up to 500 kids. Wave 2, they're about a year and a half. Our hope is to just continue to follow these kids over time. And I'm really interested in parenting and media and kind of that connection. So,
Thank you.
I guess I'm next.
Let's see.
Hi, I'm Kathy Hirsch-Pasek, and I wanted to start by just thanking you. Pam, it's amazing what you've pulled together. No, it's incredible. And Justine, I just want to tell you how refreshing. That was awesome. Okay, so what do? I am either quite eclectic or quite schizophrenic. And you can decide later. I got into this really first starting out by asking where the education was in educational apps. So wrote a piece with Michael Robb, who is over here, and Jen Zosh, who is the co-first on this one. And we went to explore what psychology could teach us about what we might put into apps that would make the apps really educational, as opposed to just having the name educational in front of it. And I've also gotten into a few other pieces. What do we have here? Okay, well, I forget what I put in. Recently spoke out in an American Pediatrics piece on the power of play and why I think we need more play in our life, where we did also consider some issues around media. I've worked a little bit on studies that look at the impact that we've been talking about of media and digital toys and screens and ebooks on young children. And I've also looked at the question of what happens when your parent is using media, and how does that impact the nature of that parent-child interaction that Jim is talking about. So in one study, we looked at FaceTime, which preserves a lot of the right stuff to have good interactions, and at what happens in cell phone use, where it actually breaks the very interactions that you might hope for. And as Justine was really talking about this, there's the positive and the negative to point out in what technology can be and can offer. And so today I bring you all a challenge. And my challenge for you, because unfortunately I have to go teach a class tomorrow and can't be here to discuss it with you, but my challenge to everyone is to think about whether we can use media a little bit more like a prompt than like a partner. And what I mean by that, I love the way you called it engaged or evoked or something, along those lines, is that I've now been asked, I think, 3 times in the last month or 2 months to partner with people who want to create a digital, I swear to God they called it, a digital friend. And I said, nope. I'm really not interested in that, because everything I study in my real life, I'm a language and literacy person, and everything that I study tells me that the contingent human-to-human interaction is really, really, really important. The glue that holds us together as little humans. Anything that destroys that is probably not good for kids, and anything that can prompt us to do more of it is probably great.
Great. So maybe that's as good a place to get started as any, because I think it was really good to actually have, I think I have a mic, Justine present what I think she views as the promise going forward. I'm very mindful of what you alluded to, that previous technologies have been looked at with great deal of skepticism. Those are frequently evoked from, frankly, usually from people who are mediaphiles, talking about comic books and movies. But I think there is something really fundamentally disruptive about these new technologies that is different. And I use the word disruptive, it's funny, because I think when entrepreneurs use it, they mean it as a compliment. As a pediatrician, it's a chief complaint. Nobody wants anyone to be disruptive. Let me get the group engaged in that. Would you say it's disruptive in a good way, in a bad way? Sarah, what is your research? Anyone, that's sort of a jump ball. Anyone want to?
Well, sure. So we have a bit of research that speaks to it, and I always go back to what is the data telling us. One is actually a study that was done by Jen Zosh, who's over here, where we looked at electronic shape sorters, because they've now put chips in shape sorters. And you might expect that if you have a chip in a shape sorter and you put the triangle in and it screams as it does, triangle, 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 that might be just the coolest thing that ever happened for a child. But what it tends to do is to stop the mom or dad from having the interactions and the conversations around triangles and rectangles. And that was the main finding in that study. In another study, we looked very early on at e-console books. This was in the days before the iPad, which is still actually a relatively new invention. And we found out that what happened when kids were reading these e-books with their parents or with no e, that the parents stopped having a conversation in the e-book, and there was a lot of disruption in the way it was designed. So what happened is you had them reading this little book about Clifford, and then they'd go off and go, C is for Clifford, what else starts with C? Well, it had nothing to do with the story, so the kid dropped the whole storyline and essentially learned nothing. In our cell phone study, just to give you one other example, we had a kid learning 2 new words. They were 2 words we knew they could learn when it was live. We knew you could learn it even on FaceTime. But what we did is we disrupted one of the calls with a cell phone call, or one of the words with a cell phone call, the other not. We, of course, switched those to be good experimentalists, and we found out that the interrupted word was never learned by the child, and the uninterrupted word was. So the question is, how do you stop it from getting in the way?
Yeah. So I'm really interested in the concept of technoference. I've done some research with Brandon McDaniel, who's in the back, and Jenny Rudetsky, and the ways that technology can interfere in our relationships with others. And so, for example, in our project media, we use, we just have the parent look at their phone, and then we measure kind of still face, right? Because what parents are really giving their child is a still face, and then how does that influence interactions? Generally, the research reveals it's pretty negative, but what I want to move beyond now is the different contexts that we're using technology. So, for example, something I'm looking into right now is technoference, like with your breastfeeding or your bottle feeding a very young baby, and what does that do to attachment, to maternal stress, and some others. And there's all sorts of different contexts that parents engage in with young children, and I'm not quite sure if the effects are going to be similar in terms of technoference, or if they're really dependent on context. And so, I mean, I'd love some thoughts on that as we're moving forward with our own research.
Heather, you're representing Rachel, and Rachel, I don't know if you're willing to represent Rachel in this respect, but Rachel has done many studies to talk about what infants can learn. So do you want to take the counterfactual here, or no?
Sure, sure.
Are you Rachel or are you Heather now when you say this?
I'm both. Rachel and I are almost the same person when it comes to this topic, to be honest with you. Rachel's actually a huge inspiration for my work in this area, so I think I can represent her pretty well. As far as the distraction piece goes, I think I would not disagree with the panelists. I would completely agree, but also add a caveat that we have the option to use technology and television and other media mindfully and intentionally. So while they certainly could be a disruptive factor, there are ways we can affect these technologies so that they are not that disruptive factor. So I think what we're talking about here in terms of learning is a more intentional form of technology use where we're hoping children get something out of this experience. So decades, almost 2 decades ago, actually about 2 decades ago, we had the first evidence that infants and toddlers don't seem to be learning a whole lot from screen media. In that case, it was television. We now know that it sort of goes both ways. They can learn from television if you test them with television, but if you ask them to transfer that and jump the screen to real life, that's hard. The reverse is also hard. Going from real life to video is challenging as well. So it's this sort of transfer, bridging that gap from one context to the other that's hard. There's some preliminary evidence that suggests interactive media, if it's carefully designed to guide attention to the right information at the right time, might hold more educational value for infants and toddlers. There's a big open question there still. But there's no question that by at least 3 years of age, young kids can learn quite a bit, even from television, if it's well designed and age appropriate.
To what extent do you all see as one of the challenges being that those of us that are focusing on harms or concerned about harms have done a fair amount of work, even in naturalistic environments, but those of us that are trying to sort of elicit the positives tend to do these very rarefied experiments, and if Rachel were here, I'll say to you too, that aren't actually, they're not monetized or generalized in the real world. In fact, Kathy, you alluded to it perfectly. I mean, there's a market for us to make a digital friend, which none of us, or at least some of us, don't think is a good idea. But there's a lot of money in that. I've been approached also by Amazon Alexa to help with that in Seattle. And said the same thing, that I don't want any part of it. So how do we, even if we can show something, how do we bridge that gap? Because even if we can show that these, even if Justine were able to teach, to create something that she thought was good, how do we generalize it? How do we get it out? How do we disseminate it? We're all sitting here in our echo chamber.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that comes up at a lot of these kinds of meetings where there's a clear interest in engaging media creators, for example. There's a bit of a good precedent with television. At least some creators of television have really reached out to researchers, worked in collaboration with educators and researchers. I don't know how well that track record is there for interactive media, apps and digital games. There have certainly been attempts, but at least in my personal experience with these things, there's much more of an interest in getting a name. Like, this is supported by, or we have advisors who are PhDs at these universities without much interest in studying them, testing them, and doing the kind of rigorous work that has been done with television. So it's a challenge.
Kathy or Sarah, do you want to?
No, I absolutely agree. And again, you know, I sit in the middle. I think I'm very much where Justine is at. I see a lot of promise. I mean, you can go to places that kids could never have visited before. Sure. And I think some of the augmented reality is quite exciting. But I think we have to bring humans back into the picture. And as I am wont of saying in my lab these days, humans need humans. And we have to remember that. And we are born to need humans, to learn from humans, especially in 0 to 3, which we're also learning is increasingly important to set the entire trajectory.
Well, we've known that for a long time, as far as I'm concerned. That's not it.
Yeah. But anyway, I think we have to figure out this prompt versus partner.
And I've been struggling with this for a long time. And how do you translate your research into the toys that children actually play with and the media that they actually watch? And I think that there's a great reluctance from producers and manufacturers and developers to contact the scholarly community. And some do it better than others, but some just kind of ignore us. Or at the very least, what Heather said, they just want the PhD behind your name and not your real input. So I don't know if we can reach out to those to bring them to this type of a conference, make a greater effort there to kind of both talk to each other and get that conversation going.
Let me open it up to the audience. Do people want to have any questions? Justine, you've come up quite a bit. I don't know if you want to say anything. Does anyone have any comments or questions? Yes, can you just please stand up and state your name? And
my name is Len Ostreicher, and I have a comment. You guys are hitting a lot of points I think are really important that we have. Mike, thank you. We have the situation where people need people, especially during the first year of life. And parallel to that, we have this huge problem with autism. By 18 months, these kids are testing positive with their MCHATs. Now, is there a connection between the introduction of media and the age that media gets introduced to these children keeps on getting lower and lower? At least that's my clinical impression. Is there some impact that media is having that's breaking up the human-to-human connection that these babies especially need to learn social interactions during the early part of life?
Does someone want to answer that?
Justine is dying to answer that.
Not very nice, Kathy. There's not clinical evidence to demonstrate that. And in part, that's because we don't have enough evidence. But it's also because there are so many factors that affect the age of diagnosis. And the age of diagnosis is going down because we're a lot better at diagnosis than we were, among other factors. So statistically, there does not seem to be evidence for the role of screens, but we need more data. Statistically, there is evidence for the role played by recognition of what this disorder is, that it's a spectrum, that one can be a number of places along the spectrum. So there's a lot going on, and it's overdetermined in some ways.
Unfortunately, I feel the problem's the exact opposite, that the research is not being done. It's not that the research couldn't be done, it could be done, and then the data would be there to be a lot more?
Well, I just want to, yeah, I will just add to that. There are a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, it's still quite difficult to get a diagnosis of autism very, very early on. Okay, so we don't really know. The best we can do right now is to do from the SIB study, which suggests that siblings are more likely to get autism if you have an older sib who has autism. So I think and there's one other piece of data that I think is quite interesting, which is we now have some pretty good data that if you do suspect something and you have a lot of good, what we call back and forth or contingent human interaction, that we can actually offset a fair amount of what goes on in the first year that might lead to worse symptoms in autism. But I want to urge caution here. And the caution is that we lived many, many years in this field believing that, or let me say the population at large, believed that vaccines caused autism. That was fallacious, both in what was reported, the paper was retracted, and I'd hate to see us go down that line again by thinking that we have some causal explanation here. Having said that, I think that human-human interaction is important for everyone, whether a kid turns out to be autistic or not.
Let's take another question. Actually, I'd be happy to continue that conversation because I think it's fascinating and I have my own thoughts on it, but I will move on. Do we have another question from someone?
No. Any more questions? No, I'd like to continue.
You can continue it. I'll be happy to continue with it, and I think probably everyone will be happy to continue with outside. Yes, in the back. Yeah, that's you.
Thank you. Just a quick comment about the autism thing. You know, there's research coming out showing that with autistic adults who are able to communicate, showing that eye contact is actually pretty intense, and so a lack of eye contact can be due to turning away from what's overly intense and not a lack of interest. And so you might have kids who are having trouble or distressed with that face-to-face turning to screens as a default activity. But anyway, that is one of a bigger issue, many things that we think about when we're looking at longitudinal research with kids and screens, and that's propensities. I don't know if any of you have done propensity score analysis, but just the idea of propensities being something that exists before the media use is measured and before the supposed outcome is measured. I would just love to hear what kinds of propensities you guys are looking at. Just very early life things that might lead to both more or a certain kind of media use and whatever the outcome variable is that you're interested in.
I think you raise a really important point, because the studies that we can't do that would deal with those kinds of confounders are long-term experimental studies, right? We can't actually randomize children to play particular games or spend a certain amount of time on a touchscreen for many hours a day and others to not. So we're stuck either with observational longitudinal studies or with laboratory-based studies that do short-term manipulations. And those are always going to have some degree of residual confounding. But I think the other thing that's important in what you're suggesting, for me, what's more fascinating is not so much propensity to use media or different types of media and to what extent that can confound. I'm very interested, and I think others in this room are very, in this issue of sort of differential susceptibilities, because I think that is more what drives this. I think that part of the problem is we look at a population of children as if they're monolithic, particularly in observational studies, but also in experimental studies. It's probably true that there's a susceptible fraction for whom media makes no difference whatsoever, however many hours they do it, whatever games they play. They have a sufficient amount of resilience, if you will, whether it's innate or environmental. And there's probably a susceptible fraction that is especially prone to adverse effects. From my perspective, I would even go so far as to say on the autism spectrum, but that's me. But certainly other things as well. I don't know what other people want to say about that.
Sure, so the short answer is I've not done propensity score matching or anything like that in my research, which tends to be lab experiment based. The closest examples that I know of are cross-leg longitudinal analyses, which don't get at your exact question about what precedes these things, but helps us try to tease apart in these correlational data sets what might be a predecessor temporally. And I can think of only a couple of examples of those, but the ones that I'm thinking of suggest that in many cases, the whatever behavioral problem broadly defined that we're talking about may precede increases in media use. I'm thinking, for example, Jenny Radesky has a publication on self-regulation in toddlers and media use, and she finds that early self-regulation, I don't want to say disorders, it wasn't sort of a clinical diagnosis, but relatively lower self-regulation abilities in toddlers predicted greater media use later, a couple of years later, or a year and a half later, rather than the reverse, the high-screen media use predicting poor self-regulation later. So that's one of the examples that's coming to mind. I don't know if others are aware of other studies like this.
So I'm really interested in the development of media addiction over time, and almost all the studies have been done with, say, adolescents or adults, but something's got to be happening in those first couple of years of life, right? And so it sounds like I need to learn propensity score. What is it called? I need to learn that. Yeah. Because, right, that's what I'm really interested in, is what happens during age 1, age 2, age 3, age 4, age 5, right? And you have this whole kind of lifetime of media experiences with yourself, with your parents, kind of creating this whole media environment with your family. And what are the most important things that happen during those ages that would then kind of predispose somebody to develop a serious problem with media? So I don't have the answer to that question, but I think that's where kind of the research needs to go. And that's why this age, this developmental age, is so exciting for me.
Professor Robinson, we were just talking about propensity scores, you and I at dinner, the false messiah that they are. Do you want to...
Well, I was going to comment just on that, in that I would, I'm Tom Robinson from Stanford University, and that I would argue that anything that's important enough to know the answer to, you can design an experimental study to test it. And now the alternative is, part of what we're stuck on, is if we want to prove that digital media are bad, then that's not ethical to do. You can't expose people to something that you believe, you have a hypothesis that it's bad. But if you're interested in studying, instead of the etiologies of diseases and the etiologies of problems, you're interested in studying the etiologies of solutions, and what I call solution-oriented research, you actually can study solutions experimentally. So my guess is everyone in this room has lots of hypotheses about what parents should be doing with their kids. You can randomize families to that. You may never prove that the digital technology is bad, but you don't have to if you have proven that one of your interventions actually is successful, or it's not. Even at the end of saying that it doesn't help to have an intervention that increases parent-child interaction, that tells you something as well, and that's a solution that you can't do. So I would argue that we're being held back quite a bit by thinking only in a problem-oriented way, which is thinking about all the problems that technology may be doing, or different exposures. It can be environmental exposures of any type, or it can be behavioral exposures. But it's instead of turning around the way we do form hypotheses and research questions, to think about what are the solutions we could test experimentally.
Yes. I'm sorry, you. Yes, I can't. Can you just tell us who you are? And
Courtney Blackwell. I don't need it. Okay.
No, you need it. You need it. It's ableist to assume that people can hear you.
It's not on. There you go. Okay.
The placebo works too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kudos to Pam, because Tom spoke at the ECHO SC steering committee meeting last week, and I had no idea that he would be here and I would be here. So definitely bringing in people from very different worlds together. And one comment on the longitudinal studies. Preview for Wednesday, we'll be talking about longitudinal studies, and ECHO does have prenatal cohorts, so you'll have all of the information, and genetic and behavioral and some media information. But my question, we've talked a lot about human-to-human connection and relationships, and I'm wondering your thoughts on human-to-human relationships where technology is at the center of it, whether it's peer or family, parent-child.
Well, and I wanted to come back, Tom, to what you said, just again to be super clear, that I think the question, as Justine mentioned, should no longer be is it bad or is it good? I mean, it's not like we're dumping technology, you know, any more than we dump television, or, by the way, the telephone, which everyone was deeply worried was going to ruin office interactions. So, I mean, it's really fun to read some of the, well, email for sure, but even the telephone is like incredible to read the stuff about that. And the reason I talk about prompt rather than partner is so that it doesn't take over for the human. I don't think what we can do or should think about is how to have technology replace humans, which is, I think, don't you think that's what those companies called us about when they wanted to create the digital friend? I mean, they're saying,
I think they're not thinking past the bottom line.
That may be, yeah,
I don't think, I actually think, I mean, at least in the case of Amazon, they came to me saying that they've noticed, quote unquote, that a lot of kids talk to Alexa because they're collecting that data, and they recognize that there was a opportunity. I mean, quite honest, that's what it was. That there was an opportunity to create a separate branded product, so that instead of one Alexa, every household would have now 2 Alexas, literally doubling their market. So I don't think they were thinking. I mean,
yeah, no, they might not have been. I do know some of these others were thinking about it because they said kids are spending so much time alone and they don't get together anymore. Wouldn't it be nice if we gave them a digital friend? So I think that's something that we should probably thwart quickly. And as far as doing things where you have, you know, technology in the room, I think it's great. Again, I think the expansiveness of what is possible. And I don't just mean with a screen. I too want to jump the screen. I love Osmo, you know, because it jumps the screen. I can't wait to see what people do with that technology. Or there's this other one, I think it's called Kimio. I don't know if you've ever seen it. You can play a block game, and then you take the blocks and you place them near this thing, and all of a sudden you're building towers that come alive. I mean, it's like the coolest stuff to play together. So I think having technology literally at our fingertips is wonderful. But I think we ought to change the way we think about it so that, again, we use it as prompts. And I will tell you that even something as well known as Watson, when Watson folks came to talk to me, and I'm sure they talked to most of the people in this room, they were really thinking about a delivery mode into an empty vessel head. And that's what they wanted to do with little kids. And they were deeply troubled, now this may have changed in the last 6 months, that, oh my gosh, we're not entirely sure what to do because we realize it can't be active since Watson cannot decipher kids' voices. So it couldn't have a conversation with the kid because I guess we haven't figured that out yet. So again, I think it's the replacement thing that's the problem.
I just have to put in a plug for Digital Friends.
Go for it.
Because you're getting away too easily with that statement. Because yes, all of these technologies can replace people. We can replace soldiers, we can replace workers on the assembly line, we can replace telephone care providers of all kinds, or we can bootstrap their performance, we can bootstrap their interaction with other people. So in our work, we were able to show a transfer effect from children programming a virtual peer, what we call a virtual peer, a digital friend, to their being able to better use, in fact, contingency with other real children. So there are ways of bootstrapping human-human interaction through the use of digital friends. We had the same thing with neurotypical kids, where we had 2 real children and 1 virtual child, and the real children were more evocative of complex narrative language after having played with the virtual child. So I just don't want to take it as given. Yes, it's cheaper for companies. It's better for companies if the digital friend is spending all of its time selling. But that doesn't mean that that's the only use of it.
And that sort of gets back to the point I was making before about what we do in the lab versus what actually happens in the real world and how it's disseminated. But
yeah, there are ways. I mean, I had a productive interaction with Mattel, and one of the toys that they put out was a toy that was based on that that interaction. So it's not impossible. Then again, we were both on, I think, the Fisher-Price.
Yeah. So I have a question back to you, though. I'm wondering if, in part, my lens is colored by the fact that I work with really young kids. And I really, you know, that's where I really do take a harder line.
Yeah.
I don't know how old the kids were in your study, but I have seen, you know, 2- and 3-year-olds that can't be understood, where the interactions, even with the intelligent agent of, you know, Sandy's intelligent agent, it's just the contingency isn't natural.
Yeah.
It's more like, you know, what I get from Siri.
Right.
And it's really not something that I find a conversation.
So, yeah. Right.
There's a question. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, we need to,
Yeah,
there's
we'll
someone back
continue.
there. You all will continue talking, I'm quite sure.
Nah.
Hi all, I'm Lauren Hale. I'm a professor of public health at Stony Brook, so welcome to Long Island. So I research disparities in sleep and sleep health, and I'll be moderating a panel on that in a couple of days. But one thing I haven't noticed in this community is much of a conversation about disparities in media use among small children. In sleep, we see disparities by minority status, by low-income status. Do we see that, or is access to media and iPads and Osmos, that's a privilege? How does the epidemiology line up in terms of media use in young children?
Sure. So in terms of access, at least in the US, that gap is really closing to the access to the device. So we used to talk about the digital divide in terms of access to devices. That has closed quite substantially. So I think Michael Raub can probably talk to this with more expertise, but the most recent Common Sense census on kids 0 to 8 years of age, I think it was like 97% of kids had access to at least one mobile device.
But they might be using it for different
Right, but we also talk about the app gap, which is what content are they using? And of course, anyone in the room who knows most of our work knows content is king, right? It's not the device, it's what they're doing with it. So there are still disparities, it seems, in the types of experiences that kids have when they have those devices, both in terms of the content they're consuming and the context in which they're using those devices. So there might be differences based on especially socioeconomic status and especially parent education in terms of the media mentorship that happens. So do kids have a caring adult in the world who helps them understand how to use these devices in a safe and useful way, et cetera, et cetera. So the device ownership itself, that gap is really closed, but all the other things that we think matter a lot more than quantity, all the quality kinds of questions, there are likely still disparities there.
I was wondering with the parenting of young children study whether moms or parents who work multiple jobs are more likely to use devices as babysitters, or if it's another way around, moms who are working at home on their computer are not paying attention to their kids. I don't know, and I just feel like that's an opportunity for discussion.
I can actually answer some of those questions, or a little bit. One of the studies I alluded to, the Family Life Project, is a birth cohort study of children growing up in rural poverty in Pennsylvania, North Carolina. And one of the things, and they had to make a measure for it because they did home visits, was household chaos. And one of the markers for it was really loud television on all the time, often for inappropriate content, you know, Jerry Springer type stuff that a very young child couldn't even understand what was going on, but it's very attention grabbing. And so it's, loud music, loud everything, video games, whatever. So, part of that is just, it's not even content, it's just noise pollution. But I think, especially sometimes shift working households, other things of that nature, again, disadvantaged households, you see some of that more. I think that's a little bit different than people being distracted by tablets and cell phones, so they're not paying attention, they're not interacting. Electronic babysitters have been around for a long time. They've been around since television, radio even, whatever. But I think beyond that, some of it becomes a noise thing where there's nothing really being learned, there's no interaction. The only other thing I have to contribute, though, and it was funded by the National Science Foundation, in terms of the avid or electronic friends and stuff, is they did a study of households. What was the first robot, really, that was used commonly in households? Roombas. Oh, yeah. They really found they became a member of the family. I mean, people attributed things, even the pets developed relationships with them. You know, adolescents would storm off and they'd pick the Roomba up and take it to their room with them and slam the door. I mean, people just do that stuff. And I mean, I think they do it with their electronics, maybe even more so, especially, you know, but Roombas are, of course, non-contingent. They're just there moving around, you know, but what we do with it. And I think that's where some of the intentionality is, you know, and again, some of the young children, but we don't have enough, but I'm just trying to differentiate some of the issues, because I think they all start getting tangled together.
You know, I will say, because so I'm not cast as a complete contrarian here, I will say that I think that there is, from my perspective, to Lauren's, to your question, there are some, I think, even demonstrated opportunities for creating kind of scaffolding opportunities between parents and children. Kind of, to me, that's really the sweet spot, when the technology can queue up situations for parent-child interactions. If you look at, for example, the bedtime math study, which really showed a lot of promise in older kids, which I think is important, and what that actually did. It wasn't an app that you gave to a child and left them with. It was an app that really created an opportunity for a parent and child to have meaningful interaction where they otherwise would not have. That's, for me, the sweet spot, and that really could potentially leverage technologies to narrow socioeconomic divides, because it's oftentimes low-income families that are uncomfortable doing early literacy, doing early math, and to what extent these enhanced technologies can assist with that, I think is a potential upside with real promise. There was one question here, and then that might, yes? Okay, you and then, all right, go ahead, because you had your hand up before, I believe. Yeah. I am, I believe, yes.
Hi, Susan Lynn.
Oh, hi, Susan, I didn't recognize you. It's been a while.
Yeah, it has been a while. So one of the things that I think is so appealing and compelling about technology is that you can get incredible results with very little effort. And so I'm wondering if any of you are looking at persistence in young children and the impact of these technologies where you swipe and amazing things happen.
That's a great question. Yeah, I've looked at it in adolescents, right? But I haven't looked at it in young children yet. And so I think that that's a really good area of future research. And I can't think of any research study. Maybe some of you guys have done some that has looked at that in particular. Have you? Yeah? Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. Sorry. My name is Catherine Steiner-Adair, and I wrote a book called The Big Disconnect, Protecting Childhood and Family Relationships in the Digital Age, and to do it, I went into 30 schools. And I would also suggest everybody trying to do research and understand impact, interview teachers, because they have a very different perspective. And I don't know, when I was a mom, I always couldn't wait for the report card because I felt like my teachers could see my kids in ways that I couldn't. And what I hear from teachers very consistently, as I travel around from schools trying to think, like, what's the best way to do this? And is there psychological fallout we need to pay attention to? The kindergarten teachers and the first grade teachers make this comment over and over, and this is what it is. I think I just need glitter, buckets of glitter, to throw at my kids, because they come to me after playing little a, uppercase A on the iPad, and they get glitter. They get stimulants. They get all those perks when you play and learn on an iPad, but learning in school is slow, and it's frustrating. And there are 16 to 30 other kids. So when you talk about persistence, I hear the glitter story in kindergarten, and by middle school I hear a kind of frustration in teachers. How do we get kids to go deeper in their own imagination and not come to me for the next topic sentence? And how do I get older kids to not just Google search and answer, but to think more reflectively in themselves? So who knows how much of this has to do with the fact that they're on screen so much or not. But what I do hear, and what I see developmentally, is a change in kids' capacity for deep play, for persistence, patience to learn, not to interrupt. And, you know, when you talk about Kathy, I love your work, the need for humans need humans. I hear when I say stuff, is there any bad stuff the grown-ups are doing? What I hear from kids of all ages, not just the little ones. My daddy's smartphone is a stupid phone because he says he's going to come read and he never shows up because we lose time, right? I hear the same adjectives from kids of all ages. I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm mad, I'm lonely, I'm frustrated, trying to get my parents' attention.
Thank you.
So,
yeah, may I just make a comment on that real quick?
Real quick.
All right, real quick. There's 2 bits of data that came out recently that I just found so interesting. It's with older kids, but maybe related. One is from Common Sense Media, so everybody who cares about these things, go talk to Michael. But it essentially said that the teens today and the tweens today say that they believe social media is getting in the way of their personal relationships, and that's them talking. The other is that there is a new survey that just came out from principals, and it's the first time in the top 5 things that principals were worried about that they're listing emotional health. We don't know why, but it turned out to be #1 and whopping.
Thank you. Okay, this will be the final question, and then I just want to emphasize that this is the very first day of the conference, and there's obviously a lot of energy already on this topic, and it's a small group, so you will be able to find us or each other at breakfast, so keep the conversation going, and you have the last word, or question, if it's what it is.
So I just wanted to say that we're talking about early childhood parenting, and so when we are, it seems that we're talking about a very large range here, and when we're talking about the virtual friends and whatnot, I mean, if we're talking about the youngest children, you know, 0 to 18 months, I think it's a different conversation than if we're talking about 3 and 4-year-olds, and I think we should be aware of that and maybe consider, you know, how the research should look for the very youngest as opposed to the older children. When children are at an age where they understand what they're seeing on the screen, there's, I believe, a lot more ability for them to learn from that. But the very youngest children, they're seeing lights and movement, but they don't have the context. They don't understand what those things mean. And I also want to say I do research on autism and screens, so stay tuned because we are going to be presenting stuff at this conference. And then I wanted to answer one of the questions about socioeconomic and screens, so that's one of the other things that we looked at, and we did find an association between lower socioeconomic status and earlier screen viewing and more hours of screen viewing.
You know, something that we haven't talked about in this group at all, which is surprising, is video chat with this young age group. Because the studies are consistently showing that it's a really positive thing for infants to develop a relationship with grandparents or those around them. And so I think what Heather said, you know, looking at the context around media and how that often can bring family members together as they use it together is really important.
Okay, I want to thank my panelists first and foremost and the previous, all the previous speakers and Children's Screens for bringing us together. And as I said, please keep the conversations going. I can already sense that there's going to be some heated breakfast or maybe bar conversation later. Okay, see you all later. Oh, tomorrow morning starts at,
I'm sorry?
breakfast starts at 7. Check your programs. It's in the syllabus, as they say. 7:30.